There was music from my neighbor's house through the summer nights. In his blue gardens, men and girls came and went like moths among the whisperings and the champagne and the stars.
Images of the good life, the tantalizing promise of the American dream just within reach, to anyone with the money to pay.
The real part of the book is what happens to people who have big dreams, but having them run into the limits of American society.
The vision of what we might become dances in our mind's eye. Its demands pull us down to earth, into the rat race for wealth and success.
In America, we're all caught between hope and disillusion. We all believe we're all disillusioned.
The story of one man whose hope never faded has become American legend. F. Scott Fitzgerald turned a jazz-age party giver into a hero. The tale of J. Gatsby begins in summer, 1922, on the Long Island shore. Gatsby has set up house in the town of West Egg, the biggest house he can find. He has come to win the woman he loves, Daisy Faye Buchanan, who lives just across the water with a green light at the end of her dock.
He stretched out his arms toward the dark water in a curious way, and as far as I was from him, I could have sworn he was trembling.
I think the first thing it's about is a man who tries to create himself, to invent himself through his imagination. Gatsby simply is dissatisfied with who he is as an individual, where he comes from, and he begins to intuit that there's a larger life out there, a more elegant life. So he begins to invent himself along those lines. And I think it's this that Nick Carraway sees and admires, that is the effort and the dedication that he has brought to creating himself.
Nick Carraway, a young Bond salesman and Gatsby's next-door neighbor, is the narrator of his tale.
It was an extraordinary gift for hope, a romantic readiness such as I have never found in any other person, and which it is not likely I will ever find again.
But there is something very touching about the notion that you can go from rags to riches. And that's something that happens to Gatsby in this book. He literally comes out of Nowhereville in the Midwest, and by the time we meet him in the story, he has this fabulous house that's kind of like a Disney castle on Long Island, full of wonderful objects and mesmerizing friends. There was that strong sense in Gatsby of a dedication to an ideal self that he could make of himself.
Gatsby is mysterious. There are rumors of underworld connections, bootlegging.
The air of mystery that is around Gatsby is one of the things that makes the novel quite wonderful. And if you knew more specifically about him, I think it would ruin it in a way, because it's his dream that is important.
Gatsby throws huge parties in his house, inviting the rich and the famous. The Gatsby style, the lavish scale of it all, is meant to seduce Daisy. Certainly, it has seduced us. The Great Gatsby defined an era, the Roaring '20s, when America thought the good times and revelry would never end. And over 8 decades, Gatsby has become a part of us, a fixture of our culture. The movies made him a star with several film adaptations. Warner Baxter was the first to play Gatsby in 1926. Alan Ladd did the honors 23 years later in the 1949 movie. Robert Montgomery presented Gatsby on television in 1955. So did Robert Ryan in a 1958 Playhouse 90. Then in the 1974 feature film, Robert Redford played the Great Gatsby with Sam Waterston as Nick Carraway.
It was the first big movie I was ever in, and it was a really big movie. Hundreds and hundreds of extras and everybody wearing costumes of the period from collections, you know. They recruited a lot of socialites from Newport who, just like the people at the party, stayed until they were tired of it and then went home without regard for whether the filming was over with or not. And leaving bits of Dior and Chanel on the grass as they toddled off. So there was real crossover between real life and the fantasy world.
Advertisers have used Gatsby to persuade us that our fantasies can come to life. And there's even an opera in the works, based on The Great Gatsby.
I first read it when I was 16. I remember finishing it, and the world just blew up, you know? It was this great meadow of opportunity, paradise waiting out there when you read The Great Gatsby.
Certainly the 20s, the world of The Great Gatsby, was an age when America seemed filled with opportunity.
We have to think about the 20s as being a very special period. What made it special was the fact that after the war, suddenly life became terribly prosperous. There was a crazy stock market which went up and up and up. And most of all, there was an urbanizing, people flocking to the big cities. And then there was prohibition, which in New York was a joke, and everybody was drinking more than ever before. Most of all, there was the idea that Americans had become more, quote, glamorous. It had to do with the sheer joy of living, because people felt this was going to be America forever and ever.
Americans at this point in time, and certainly in Gatsby's point in time, were interested in projecting their personality through the things they owned. And in a sense, Gatsby manufactures a personality by the things he chooses. And we do that all the time. We just don't like to confess we do it. We manufacture a personality by the clothes we choose to wear and where we choose to buy them. Those are all expressions of who we are.
Fitzgerald wrote a book and a character, threaded with the story of America itself.
Fitzgerald, I think, was looking at America when he created Gatsby. Gatsby modeled himself on a man named Dan Cody, whose name really is a combination of Daniel Boone and William Buffalo Bill Cody, men who began the frontier and then who ended the frontier.
And Gatsby has been to war. He's a veteran returned from World War I.
Here's Gatsby, who has a very big career in the Army. He comes out of Major and all the rest of it. But his real life is wanting to get back the girl he knew briefly before he went overseas, Daisy. And what happens? Daisy has married an awful rich man, Tom Buchanan.
Tom bulges with muscles. He embodies power. And people who cross him usually suffer for it.
The Buchanans and their friends, like Jordan Baker, are a different kind of rich than Gatsby. They're old money. This is the world of privilege and idle pleasure.
We ought to plan something. All right. What do we plan?
Nick Carraway is Daisy Buchanan's cousin, but he, like his neighbor Gatsby, is an outsider in the world of the Buchanans. He works for a living.
The story is told by Nick Carraway, who is not Fitzgerald, but is the person Fitzgerald wanted to be. Sardonic, quiet, very much the guy who stands in the background watching.
Everyone suspects himself of one of the cardinal virtues, and this is mine. I am one of the few honest people that I've ever known.
It seems to me that he wanted to be a part of this very glamorous world. But there was something creepy about it for him, too, I think. But he was definitely attracted.
He's from the Middle West. That's very important. The Middle West was a place of innocence, where honesty reigned. The East in the book represents wealth, decadence, corruption, illegal sex, and all the rest of it.
Tom Buchanan embodies the Eastern establishment.
Tom Buchanan, who was so imperious and so rich and so haughty that he dominates things, and he's not ashamed to openly have a mistress.
To Myrtle Wilson, Tom represents the American dream, a way to move up in the world. Her husband George on Gashnon Road, New York City.
The book is of people who are from very, very highly stipulated social groups. Myrtle Wilson comes from labor. with a L. Tom Buchanan comes from Capital, a great big C, maybe a couple of them if you can spell it that way. Daisy is a rich girl who's really never had to work a day in her life.
The Wilsons, of course, represent the failure to succeed in America, particularly George Wilson. He is the idealist who has come to New York in order to make a career for himself, and of course exactly the opposite has happened.
America is full of dreamers, and this story is full of people who have dreams. But society is also full of dead ends.
Wilson's roadside garage on the outskirts of the city is surrounded by desolate scrap heaps, an area called the Valley of Ashes.
It's a smoldering ruin of commercial society, but hanging over it are the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg, who's left behind this advertising sign, this billboard that in the book functions like a kind of eye of God, marking the place where the city stops and this pastoral green dream of Gatsby's rolling on into the future begins.
To Gatsby, the future means repeating the past. The love he had with Daisy before the war. He asks Nick to arrange a rendezvous.
Gatsby, his hands still in his pockets, was reclining against the mantelpiece in a strained counterfeit of perfect ease, even of boredom. His head leaned back so far that it rested against the face of a defunct mantelpiece clock, and from this position, his distraught eyes stared down at Daisy, who was sitting frightened but graceful on the edge of a stiff chair.
We've met before.
Luckily, the clock took this moment to tilt dangerously at the pressure of his head, whereupon he turned and caught it with trembling fingers and set it back in place. Then he sat down rigidly, his elbow on the arm of the sofa and his chin in his hand.
The act of catching a falling clock, that clock wasn't there to tell you it's 11:37. It was there to tell you something about your relationship to time.
For Gatsby, the years he'd been apart from Daisy are meaningless. He believes he can repeat the past.
He just doesn't think that time exists. But of course, Gatsby is by no means freakish in his idea that time can be changed. Every American looks back to the past. Every American thinks he can change the past and go back to it and make the present as good as it was when he was a child.
You always have a green light that burns all night long at the end of your dock.
The green light means sort of infinite dreams, infinite possibility. But Fitzgerald, through Nick Carraway, is smart enough to point out that the green light, as soon as Gatsby meets Daisy, the green light no longer can exist for him as the symbol of an infinite possibility. It's just a green light now.
Possibly it had occurred to him that the colossal significance of that light had now vanished forever.
And at that moment, the whole book starts to slide down. The tragedy is inevitable now because one thing after another, one dream, one memory after another will collapse for Gatsby and Daisy and for all the people kind of cheering them on.
To put it very simply, Fitzgerald was Gatsby. Gatsby is portrayed as a hick whose only moment of glory came when he came to New York. Fitzgerald really felt déclassé the way Gatsby did.
Like Gatsby, Fitzgerald was a Midwesterner, born in St. Paul, Minnesota, the son of a well-bred but unsuccessful businessman, Edward Fitzgerald, and Molly McQuillan, daughter of Irish Catholic immigrants.
If you go to St. Paul and you look at the houses in the area where he was born, you get a real insight into his background, because he was born on a street, Summit Avenue, where there are some of the most beautiful houses in St. Paul. And then you have the house where Fitzgerald was born in the middle of all of this great splendor. And you can see right there that he was, as he once put it, a pauper among millionaires. And he was always, all throughout his life, conscious of his position.
Even as a young boy, Fitzgerald was driven to write, and thrilled by his first appearance in print at the age of 13. The St. Paul Academy published his mystery story in the school paper. Like Gatsby, Fitzgerald had ambitions beyond the Midwest. He left for the East, first for prep school, then to college in Princeton.
Fitzgerald is trying to do in his own life what Gatsby tries to do. I mean, Fitzgerald early in his life had this romantic fling with a woman named Ginevra King, who was this beautiful, rich debutante from the Chicago area whom he met when he was home from college. And she was as unattainable for Fitzgerald as Daisy Buchanan is for Gatsby. I mean, Gatsby himself is an outsider trying to win the beautiful Daisy Buchanan, who is the consummate insider, and trying to make his way in the society of Tom and Daisy Buchanan, where he really isn't wanted.
She's got an indiscreet voice. It's full of...
My voice is full of money.
At the beginning of the book, when he sees Daisy again, he has this wonderful sentence that her voice, which is so wonderful, it's a voice he caught perfectly, that come hither quality, which in our time Jackie Onassis perfected. She spoke in this low, quiet voice, making you, especially a gentleman, come closer and closer.
We haven't met for many years.
That was it. I never understood before. It was full of money. That was the inexhaustible charm that rose and fell in it, the jingle of it, the cymbal song of it. High in a white palace, the king's daughter, a golden girl.
Another model for Daisy was surely a dazzling Southern belle named Zelda Sayre. Fitzgerald met her after he left Princeton for the Army. He was stationed for training in Montgomery, Alabama.
Zelda was the prettiest girl in town, the most sought-after, flashiest, sexiest girl in town. And of course, that's exactly the kind of girl that Fitzgerald would go after, the one that everybody else wanted. Fitzgerald always had to have the top girl, and Zelda was the top girl.
Fitzgerald married Zelda in 1920, the same year his novel, This Side of Paradise, was published. It was a great success, and Scott and Zelda were living high. Accounts of their escapades, like dancing in the fountain at New York's Plaza Hotel, made them a legend of their time.
The Plaza Fountain always reminds one of Zelda and Scott, dancing, throwing themselves into the fountain, doing transgressive things, as Gatsby could give parties that went on until all hours with strange people playing the piano and drunks in all the corners.
Right from the start, they had this image of being this fun-loving, high-living couple. They did become kind of the first celebrity couple. Fitzgerald kept scrapbooks, and his scrapbooks are filled with little gossip column tidbits about them. You know, they were at this club last night, and they were doing this night. And to some extent, I think the fascination with Fitzgerald that exists to today remains as a result of that kind of cult of excitement and celebrity, that aura that surrounds the Fitzgeralds.
When The Great Gatsby was published in 1925, the glittering world and the great romance seemed straight out of Fitzgerald's own life with Zelda.
Malcolm Cowley, who was a friend of Fitzgerald's and, of course, also one of the leading critics of the 20s, said that Fitzgerald was like a little boy who had brought the prettiest girl to the dance, because he always had to have the prettiest girl. But he was also like that little boy standing outside the dance, looking in at the dancers, wondering who had paid for the dance. I mean, he was both trying to become an insider and always aware of his outsider status.
The high life of Zelda was putting Fitzgerald in debt. To pay the bills, he had to sell short stories to magazines like the Saturday Evening Post, stories he felt were beneath his talent. When he delivered the finished manuscript of Gatsby, Fitzgerald wrote his editor, Max Perkins.
Dear Max, under separate cover, I'm sending you my third novel, The Great Gatsby. I think at last I've done something really my own. But how good my own is remains to be seen.
Behind the glamour of Fitzgerald, symbol of the carefree jazz age, lay self-doubt and already a hint of despair.
I got fascinated with Fitzgerald because he was so much the spirit of that age himself, you know, leaping into the Plaza Fountain. And now I look at him and you see much more of the terrible self-knowledge which he had very early on. It's all there in Gatsby. He knew what he was doing to himself. He was a bad drunk, bad drunk. I really don't think that you can understand Fitzgerald's works until you understand it through the lens of alcohol It is the drug of possibility. Everything is possible. Fitzgerald saw so much of the world through that kind of first drink lens.
The gay, romantic image of the Fitzgeralds' life and marriage masked a harder reality.
Almost from the beginning, they fought a lot. There was a good deal, I think, certainly fairly early on, of professional jealousy. Zelda aspired to have a life of her own in a way. Eventually, she began to have ambitions of writing herself. She felt stifled. She started to dance late in the 20s. But there was a lot of tension, almost right from the start.
Even as Fitzgerald was writing about Daisy Buchanan's affair with Gatsby, Zelda was having a romance with a French naval aviator on the Riviera. Still, shortly before Gatsby was published, Fitzgerald wrote a friend,
"The cheerfulest things in my life are first, Zelda, and second, the hope that my book has something extraordinary about it. Zelda and I sometimes indulge in terrible 4-day rows that always start with a drinking party, but we're still enormously in love, and about the only truly happily married couple I know."
The Fitzgeralds moved constantly with their daughter Scotty, from the United States to Europe and back again. Zelda's mental condition worsened.
She had a series of nervous breakdowns starting in about 1930 and really was never healthy thereafter. I mean, she was in and out of institutions. They lived together for short periods of time, and then she would have another relapse and she would go to a clinic.
Eventually, Zelda had to be permanently institutionalized and Fitzgerald's expenses mounted. In the 30s, he went west to Hollywood to try his hand as a screenwriter.
He wasn't a success in Hollywood in terms of, again, creatively. Somehow he was always rewritten to the extent that he wasn't given screen credit, but he was paid, and so he had made a lot of money. And that enabled him to pay Zelda's bills, to pay Scotty's tuition bills, to pay his debts to Scribner's and to his agent. He was very careful to pay off his debts. I mean, he was profligate, but he was always aware of how much money he owed. He didn't have very many debts when he died, if any.
He was a very moral man, and he lived a very moral life in spite of the fact that it was a disaster. But, you know, he paid his bills, and he sent his daughter to college, and he took care of his wife, and he wrote what he had to. And he left an insurance policy behind. Yeah, he was a very moral man.
Fitzgerald would die of a heart attack in Hollywood in 1940 at the age of 44. At the end, he had a relationship with another woman, Sheila Graham, the gossip columnist. But he never left Zelda.
It was a tragic love affair, but it was a constant love affair. He never divorced her. There was never even any question that he would divorce her. And they remained in some sort of beyond technical way true to one another. Even when they were most estranged, they still wrote very affectionate, nostalgic letters back and forth to each other.
Oh, Zelda, this was to have been such a cold letter, but I don't feel that way about you. Once we were one person, and always it will be a little that way.
Echoes of Fitzgerald's romantic faith ring through the pages of Gatsby. A faith that overcomes time and the disillusion of life.
The thing that makes it so remarkable is that Fitzgerald really believed in love. He really believed in being in love. I mean, it's something which is faithful, lasting, deep, profound. The book is not about sex, it's about love. That there's nothing like it in the world. Gatsby is often called the greatest novel of the 20s, I think it is. The Great Gatsby captured what is called the Jazz Age, and the Jazz Age was known for this air of infinite, everlasting merriment, you see. Everybody was going, you see.
This was before the stock market crash, before the Depression and World War II. New York City, where Gatsby and Nick and Tom Buchanan made money, was a boomtown with no thought of the future.
He's portraying Manhattan as the captured dream. That's where the women are more exotic and more wonderful, where the men are richer. When he describes Fifth Avenue, for example, in the shopping districts, he makes it sound like the Arabian Nights.
America had changed to an age of consumption. Literally, there were sociologists and popular philosophers urging us to buy, buy, buy. It's like looking at the baby pictures of this country that we have grown up with and that we still live in the late 90s.
Fitzgerald understood the consumer age because he had worked briefly in advertising. He commented on the business in a letter to his daughter, Scotty.
Advertising is a racket like the movies and the brokerage business. You cannot be honest without admitting that its constructive contribution to humanity is exactly -0. It is simply a means of making dubious promises to a credulous public.
He was well aware of the power of advertising. Dr. T.J. Eckelberg's glasses, of course, reflect that, trying to suggest the blindness that is out there, and inability, really, to see clearly and how things get distorted. But someone like Myrtle Wilson is clearly a product of the new advertising.
I'm going to make a list of all the things I've got to get. A massage, and a wave, and a collar for the dog.
Consumers of the 1920s were surrounded by media images, from magazines and from the movies.
The cult of celebrity is created in America at exactly the same time that F. Scott Fitzgerald is writing Gatsby. It's people like Mary Pickford, for example, and Douglas Fairbanks, who become overnight celebrities and whose doings are followed and whose clothing is copied and whose possessions become the envy of the world.
New money was competing with old money, and a flood of immigrants and Southern blacks to the cities meant competition for jobs. The America of the 19th century, Nick's America of the Midwest, seemed to be disappearing.
The 20s was a decade of all kinds of immigration problems, the age of the first great really restrictive immigration bill in American history. And The Great Gatsby is just impacted with people whose names have the wrong endings and who come from the wrong parts of Europe, the eastern and the southern parts, straight, evidently, to Gatsby's parties. Fitzgerald is saying, here are these people. They're interesting, they're crude, they're vulgar, but they're here, and they're part of this America in the 1920s.
Civilization's going to pieces. I've gotten to be a terrible pessimist about things. Have you read The Rise of the Colored Empires by this man Goddard?
Tom is very rich, and he's a racist. He's already worried about the coming victory of the black people. And he says, this country isn't what it used to be. Well, it's not. And Tom is one of the reasons why it's not what it used to be. So he doesn't understand this in many ways.
Clearly, the people in The Great Gatsby talk a good deal about virtually every moral subject under the sun. Well, it clearly doesn't mean anything to any of them. One of the reasons why Gatsby is a hero is that, unlike Tom and Daisy Buchanan, he believes in love and marriage and the family, in fidelity, in romance, and in all of those things that one would imagine were completely on the other side of the aisle.
No. Gatsby turned out all right in the end.
And Nick Carraway comes to see Gatsby, the bootlegger and shady operator, as the true man of honor among thieves.
Nick Carraway, his whole relationship to Jay Gatsby is only possible when you imagine that Nick is a wonderful, kind of grand bourgeois of the late 19th, early 20th century. He really believes in manners, he believes in toleration.
Nick may be a man of principle, but his morality is complex. It also allows him to support Gatsby's adulterous love affair with Daisy.
In Nick's case, I didn't think he was a terrible person at all. The way I saw it, he acted nobly in very ambiguous circumstances. He arranges for Daisy to meet Gatsby, yes. But I took him at his word that he was the most honest person he knew.
The characters of The Great Gatsby are trying to write new rules in a time of changing values. A dangerous game because the old order has not yet crumbled altogether.
It was a very class-stratified society. It was very difficult to move between classes. Old money meant more than new.
Gatsby's dream runs up against the divisions of American society.
He doesn't really make a distinction between his kind of money and Tom Buchanan's money. And this is going to, of course, lead to his downfall, because in the scene in the Plaza Hotel, when Tom Buchanan reveals where Gatsby's money is coming from, it's at that point, of course, that the dream is over, that his hope for Daisy is long gone.
Daisy's leaving you. Nonsense.
I am, though.
She's not leaving me. Certainly not for a common swindler who'd have to steal the ring he put on her finger.
There's never any hope that Gatsby could really succeed. When you're 16 and you read it, you believe there is hope, that somehow he and Daisy could go off together. But no, it was impossible. That's why the book is a tragedy.
I won't stand this. Oh, please, Tom. Let's get out.
Tom Buchanan, gloating in his victory over Gatsby, even orders Daisy to drive back home in Gatsby's car.
Go on, he won't annoy you. I think he realizes that his presumptuous little flirtation is over.
And they were gone. Without a word. Snapped out, made accidental, isolated like ghosts even from our pity.
We're supposed to believe that Gatsby is hopelessly forever and ever in love with Daisy. And then it turns out he will never get her back, that he's misunderstood who Daisy was. What she's in for is the big money. She can accept the fact that her husband is disloyal and all the rest of it because everything that counts is money.
Gatsby becomes really a victim of not knowing a good deal about American culture, particularly the difference of the classes. Gatsby, I think, can be looked at as a kind of inverted Western. The young boy goes from the West to the East, meets the girl, gets involved in a shootout, in this case it's at the Plaza Hotel with Tom Buchanan, and loses both the shootout and the girl.
Fitzgerald created Gatsby in the image of America. But Gatsby has also cast his shadow over our life and literature.
The first time I read The Great Gatsby was when I was quite a young teenager, and I read The Great Gatsby because I saw Robert Ryan being the Great Gatsby on TV, and the production mesmerized me. It absolutely grabbed me somewhere deep in the heart, and I was at the public library the next morning looking for a copy of The Great Gatsby.
And for many of today's novelists writing in a very different time, The Great Gatsby has always been more than just required reading.
And I was a freshman at Princeton, and I remember sitting there in that kind of wonderful summer, sitting under a tree reading that book, and how exciting it was for me. Opened up all kinds of things I'd never thought of.
I mean, it's absolutely casts its spell every time you pick it up. And you know, we're professionals, we get jaded, we read hundreds of books. Every time I pick this book up, it's as if I'm 17 years old again.
I think I took all the wrong things from the book. Like, I really wanted to be at those parties, right?
Yeah,
I wanted to be in the middle of those parties, and I wanted to be drinking that champagne and getting to know those starlets.
Over the 70-odd years since it was published, The Great Gatsby has become both part of American culture and a creator of it.
Advertisers today will routinely use the term, "let's Gatsby this," when you're talking to them. Gatsby would sell because it appeals to poshness on the one hand. If you acquire these objects, you will be posh and wonderful. You see the same kind of commercial connection if you look at contemporary clothiers, for example, who tend to show bureau drawers with hundreds and hundreds of beautiful shirts and ties spilling out of them.
When Gatsby shows off his house to Daisy, he unveils drawers full of beautiful custom-made shirts.
The shirt scene is compelling to me because it's so tactile. We've all felt pleasure in the touch of things, and however abstract ideas may be, and maybe this is the most American thing of all, do we as Americans ever trust an idea or an ideology as opposed to trusting whatever it is that's the object of our heart's desire that we can tangibly hold on to? That, to me, is what's compelling about those shirts. We are a nation of shoppers. Gatsby is a shopper.
The novel is clearly universal. And the reason for the universality of this is that it kind of matches Western experience over the last century and a half. Everyone understands the idealism of becoming better, richer, better looking, more fortunate, more loved. And Fitzgerald knew people wanted a story in which there's a genuine striving to fulfill this really central idea of the West over the last century, becoming. All these other things, success, money, consumption, they're only reflections of that idea. They're not the idea.
But Fitzgerald worried about how Gatsby would be understood. When he delivered the book, he wrote Max Perkins, his editor.
Dear Max, by now you've received the novel. There are things in it I'm not satisfied with in the middle of the book, chapters 6 and 7, and I may write in a complete new scene in proof.
Fitzgerald was even unsure about the title.
I hope you got my telegram. Trimalchio in West Egg. Well, the only other titles that seem to fit it are Trimalchio and On the Road to West Egg.
I can't imagine this book being called Trimalchio, which was another name after the classical great party giver, or Under the Red, White, and Blue, or Gold-Hatted Gatsby. I mean, somehow all those titles sound awful. But he did struggle with the title a great deal. He struggled with the book. Even in galleys, he was rewriting it up until the very end and rearranging scenes and rewriting sections of it.
In fact, when The Great Gatsby was published, it received only a lukewarm reception.
Most reviewers missed the mythical dimension of the story. In other words, they thought it was the story of a bootlegger on Long Island falling in love with a rich girl.
When The Great Gatsby came out, it sold 20,000 copies. This is not a lot for an author who had achieved so much popularity with his first book about Princeton, This Side of Paradise, and had become a cult figure. Gatsby was a failure.
Just before he died, he wondered sadly why he couldn't buy his novels, and he thought they were out of print. Actually, they were in print. His work was in print. It just wasn't carried. It wasn't stocked by bookstores. Scribner had a warehouse full of his stuff.
Then people began to recognize after his death what was there, and in an extremely material age indeed, the 1950s, the book began to take off. And it started selling by the hundreds of thousands and continues to sell by the hundreds of thousands every year.
If he had only lived a little longer, he would have seen the paperback revolution, he would have seen TV, he would have seen movies making The Great Gatsby.
The 1974 movie sparked a Gatsby craze. America discovered him all over again.
The publicity machine really took on a life of its own. There was Gatsby everything. There was Gatsby decor and Gatsby clothes and all this stuff.
Gatsby has become an international celebrity. The novel has been translated into at least 18 languages. There is even a Japanese theater adaptation, with women playing the men's roles. And an opera based on The Great Gatsby is being composed for New York's Metropolitan Opera House.
I liked the musical impression I had of the book, which was both from the sound of the book and all the references to the music that's going on. People who live around music on the radio and at their parties and so forth. Some people who have talked to me about the book say that everything important about the book can't be in the libretto, which is true because the important things in the book are descriptions and connections. But to me, that's an advantage because that's where the opera is, you know, that's where the music is.
Oh, wonderful opera. In many ways, the book isn't written in the realist prose style. What the book asks you to do is register experience in each sentence, I think. That might be a nice way to put it. All throughout the book, you'll find that you're asked to think poetically.
When he was starting the novel, Fitzgerald wrote,
I want to write something new, something extraordinary and beautiful and simple and intricately patterned.
The opening scene, when Nick Carraway goes over to the house for dinner, is one of the most beautiful things in American literature. Daisy is sitting on a sofa in a white dress, along with Jordan.
The only completely stationary object in the room was an enormous couch on which two young women were buoyed up as though upon an anchored balloon. They were both in white, and their dresses were rippling and fluttering as if they had just been blown back in after a short flight around the house.
The lines actually scan some time, the lines of prose. It's full of the most beautiful musical cadences. The language is its own music.
There's an amazing letter to Maxwell Perkins toward the end, and we were saying toward the end, we're talking about a young man. He was 39 years old, and he said, in my own way, I was a kind of original. And it's so heartbreaking to me to read that line, and I love to think of him in some writer's heaven, sitting at a bar stool, toasting everybody that sold him short.
I had quite a heated exchange with a writer friend of mine who objects very much to the lionization of Fitzgerald because he was such at different times a reprobate and socially insensitive. She said, well, you know, why didn't he write about the You know, the striking miners being killed in West Virginia and Kentucky in the 30s. Where was he when this was going on? And I think that is in here. I think that this world of careless wealth, of gathering and indifference to the people who get the Wilsons, the people who get run over by these careless lives, that is all in here, I think.
Myrtle Wilson becomes the first victim of the careless rich.
Poor Myrtle, she suffers terribly at the hands of Buchanans. Don't forget, Tom smashes her nose
breaks her
earlier
nose.
on in the book.
The violence of her death is very, very carefully laid into the text in such a way that you're not meant to miss just how violent the death is. That she's literally been torn open by this carelessness.
As Gatsby and Daisy are on their way home from the city, Gatsby's car runs over Myrtle Wilson, and the car does not stop.
I think that one of the emotions that Fitzgerald brought to this novel, and he always said that he could never write unless he was writing out of a sense of his own emotion, is his own disappointment with what he called the cruel rich. And the novel tends to suggest that these are people who expect to get through life doing whatever they want to do with the license of their money.
Helped a friend deliver a yacht one time, and we sailed right past where Gatsby would have lived. We delivered the boat, then we had to catch a taxi cab back to Kennedy Airport. And we're chatting about how Gatsby would have lived here, and he would have seen this and that. And suddenly this cab driver says, "Oh yeah, Gatsby. Oh yeah. I used to live right over there by Great Neck, and geez, parties. Incredible. I had an uncle who used to work as a waiter over there at those parties. That was something else, that Gatsby, I tell you. He's real to these people."
I believe this book is a great work of art, one of the great works of fictive art in the 20th century.
It's a book in which I think, like no other book, the American soul recognizes itself. It recognizes its longing across these vast spaces. It recognizes its desire to rise, and it recognizes what happens to it when it adopts the instruments by which it must rise, the inevitably corrupting effect of those instruments.
Some way he does include so much of what is our curious way of, through our very optimism, destroying everything around us.
Exactly.
And it is so peculiarly an American novel.
It is from this point that Nick Carraway's innocence becomes another casualty of Gatsby's story.
Did you see any trouble on the road? Yes. Was she killed? Yes. I thought so. I told Daisy I thought so. It's better that the shock should all come at once. She stood it pretty well.
When Nick presses Gatsby to explain Myrtle's hit-and-run death, the truth is revealed.
How the devil did it happen? Well, I tried to swing the wheel. Was Daisy driving? Yes. But of course I'll say I was.
The ending is the most difficult part of the novel, simply because we don't know what Tom Buchanan really knew. If you look at the critics, half of them think that he knew Daisy was driving the car, and the other half don't believe that he knew that Daisy was driving the car. I think that the novel answers that question, but it answers it in a very roundabout way.
Daisy and Tom were sitting opposite each other at the kitchen table with a plate of cold fried chicken between them and 2 bottles of ale. He was talking intently across the table at her, and in his earnestness, his hand had fallen upon and covered her own. Once in a while, she looked up at him and nodded in agreement. They weren't happy, and neither of them had touched the chicken or the ale, and yet they weren't unhappy either. There was an unmistakable air of natural intimacy about the picture, and anybody would have said that they were conspiring together.
The thing that was shocking to him was that after this stupendous disaster that in its aftermath, the salvation of the sort of social situation so governed everything that they knew exactly what to do, how to revert to the proprieties and to what would look all right.
The suggestion there is, at least to me, that Tom knew that Daisy was driving the car and that Gatsby was not driving it. This is very important because when George Wilson comes to Tom Buchanan, believing that it was his car, Tom tells him that it's Gatsby's car and gives him the impression that Gatsby was driving. And if Tom really knows that Gatsby wasn't driving the car, then he really becomes complicit in Gatsby's death. I mean, he pulls the trigger, so to speak, by sending George Wilson on that mission to kill Gatsby.
Wilson avenges his wife. He shoots Gatsby to death in his swimming pool.
And I think that the novel, in its final summary, its final remarks about what Fitzgerald would call the cruel rich, wanted to turn the screw one more time. What I think he did was to suggest that Tom did know. And to that extent, Tom is as guilty as Wilson in the death of Gatsby.
And with the death of Gatsby and his dream, Fitzgerald may have been saying something more about America.
I think Tom and Daisy are the least of our troubles in that novel. Tom and Daisy seem to me to be very minor characters indeed, of almost no consequence, as the crime is of almost no consequence, except that it ultimately creates that moral order that suddenly intervenes and puts Gatsby beyond our reach forever. The American dream kills Gatsby, his own aspirations to have it all, to remake his past, to be somebody different. That's what kills Gatsby.
It's an epic novel. It's about Icarus, who flew too close to the sun. Icarus was so pleased with his waxen wings that he flew too close to the sun, the wings melted, and down he went. That's why it's so hot in this story. It's the hottest story ever written, maybe. Hot, hot, hot. This is a novel of dangerous summertime. The mythological part of the book is the dream. The real part of the book is what happens to people who have big dreams.
Gatsby ends up being a mythical character because he never loses his belief in possibility, I think. He is disappointed, but not disillusioned, I think. Nick Carraway is disillusioned, and he goes back to the Midwest where he hopes that things will be honest and pure and clean.
Ultimately, although Gatsby may be done in by the American dream, I don't believe that the American dream dies. I believe it goes rolling on out there.
What he was saying about America, and he said it in the very last page of The Great Gatsby, more beautifully than anybody ever did it, is that America is the country of lost innocence.
As the moon rose higher, the inessential houses began to melt away, until gradually I became aware of the old island here that flowered once for Dutch sailors' eyes. A fresh green breast of the New World.
See, the book is a great elegy to the American dream. That's what it really is.
It's one of those experiences that for me has never lost its magic. I still open the book and I still read about Gatsby's shirts, and I still see the spot of green on the end of the dock. And there are times when I feel maybe I've deluded myself all these years and it's not possible to get to that spot of green. But then the minute I close the book, I say to myself, no, brace yourself, girl. You're going to get there.
Fitzgerald always lived in dreams, and he accomplished them. He thought that America lived in dreams and would always have nightmares as a result. And that's why he's so touching to us, because he caught the whole conflict at the heart of the American dream, which is that no one can be rich and happy forever and ever, except that his characters act as if they could, you see.
Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgastic future that year by year recedes before us. It eluded us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch out our arms farther, and one fine morning. So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past.
The important word there is against. And the important image there is of a man doing something purposely navigating. So much of the book has been about unconscious movement by people who don't know what they're doing. And the reason the book ends with that image is that you have a man going against a historical current. And, you know, his muscles are working and his back is moving and he's got his timing right and he's going against the current ceaselessly.
Near the end of his life, Fitzgerald wrote his daughter, Scotty,
"What little I've accomplished has been by the most laborious and uphill work. And I wish now I'd never relaxed or looked back, but said at the end of The Great Gatsby, I found my line. From now on, this comes first. This is my immediate duty. Without this, I am nothing."
Fitzgerald knew that The Great Gatsby would endure.
Scott, we toast you wherever you are. Do you know when I was in college, his grave is not far from where we lived then. We drove over to Rockville with a bottle of wine and poured wine on his grave and read from The Great Gatsby.
Fitzgerald's tombstone in Rockville, Maryland, is inscribed with an epitaph, the very last line from The Great Gatsby. So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past.